whether you are playing a family-friendly action RPG or diving into dark dungeons with monsters around every corner, nothing makes you feel more heroic than a badass sword by your side. Let's face it, a hero is only as cool as the weapon that they wield. So, obviously, our favorite RPGs do their best to make us fall in love with some of their most creative and interesting weapons, to the point where we find ourselves purchasing extremely expensive real-life replicas. Yeah, guilty as charged here. Anyway, on this episode of Fantasy Kingdom, we'll be diving into every RPG out there as I give you guys the top 10 most recognizable and most popular blades in the history of role-playing games. For this list, we'll be using the term blade loosely, as I'll be covering different types and variations of, quote, swords, unquote. When we get to some of the entries on this list, you'll know what I mean. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more RPG content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Fantasy Kingdom, and this is my top 10 most iconic blades in role-playing games. Let's get it. Number 10, Frostmourne, World of Warcraft. So a majority of the games that each of these blades on this list appear in, I have personally played and beat at least once. With that being said, I have never, in my life, played World of Warcraft. Still, even me, someone that has never spent a single day of my life playing WoW, knows of Frostmourne and what the sword looks like. That's how iconic the most famous sword in World of Warcraft really is. The iconic blue, icy look of the blade makes it stand out more than most swords of the franchise, but it's the history of the sword that really makes it as iconic as it is. Forgive me for getting any details wrong, but from what I understand, this sword was wielded by the infamous Lich King, and it essentially brought the world close to ruin when it was wielded by him. I don't know much more than that, other than the fact that the sword was extremely important to one of the campaigns of World of Warcraft. Still, if someone were to show me a picture of this iconic sword, I honestly would immediately know that it comes from the World of Warcraft franchise, which is exactly why it cracks today's list. Number 9, Revolver Gunblade, Final Fantasy VIII. Square Enix is no slouch when it comes to giving us iconic swords that would forever be sketched into our memory. And the series that has delivered more iconic swords than any other Square Enix franchise is without a doubt the Final Fantasy series. So with that in mind, you could expect a few iconic blades from Final Fantasy to appear on this list, starting with Final Fantasy VIII's very own Revolver Gunblade. This is the sword wielded by the main protagonist of the game, Squall. Revolver Gunblade, as the name suggests, combines a revolver and a sword into a single weapon, allowing the sword to deal both melee attacks and fire shots out of the revolver attached to the hilt of the sword. While Gunblades have appeared in multiple Final Fantasy games, and even outside of the Final Fantasy series as well, none of them are as iconic, recognizable, or as badass looking as Squall's very own Revolver Gunblade. Number 8, Masamune, Chrono Trigger. Masamune is a broadsword that has become famous with fans of JRPGs. While the name Masamune has been used in multiple games, including the Final Fantasy series, Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross introduces two variations of it that most fans of the series would instantly recognize. For Chrono Trigger, the Masamune is famous for being the weapon that is forged by combining the rare resources known as Dreamstone with the broken Masamune sword itself. After which, Frog the Frog, whose real name is Glenn, yeah I know, stick with me here, can then wield the powerful Masamune sword. And man, does Frog know how to wield this thing. Number 7, Erdrick's Sword, Dragon Quest. In hindsight, I probably should have just done a whole video on Square Enix swords and blades, considering that so many of the games that appear on today's list were developed by them. That of course includes the Dragon Quest series, and the next sword on today's list, Erdrick's Sword. This sword dates back to the original game of the series and appears in multiple mainline entries. On top of that, it also has variations of it that appears in other mainline Dragon Quest games. As the name suggests, Erdrick's Sword is the weapon that was wielded by the famous hero from Dragon Quest III, Erdrick. The sword appears in the previous entries of the series as well, though both of those games are actually sequels to Dragon Quest III, and a similar version of Erdrick's Sword appears in the newest mainline entry of the series, Dragon Quest XI, known as the Sword of Light. The sword immediately gives off heroic vibes with the golden angelic design of the hilt, so it makes sense that said sword is used by multiple heroes throughout the Dragon Quest franchise. Number 6, Monado, Xenoblade Chronicles. One of the more unique swords aka blades on today's list is Shulk's Monado from Xenoblade Chronicles. This sword is not your traditional looking sword, as it isn't a hunk of steel forged by dwarves to slay monsters and demons. Instead, it's an energy-like weapon that can do magical stuff with energy and particles and somehow allows the wielder to see the future and reshape the world in their vision. Okay, so it's a bit hard to explain exactly what the Monado is, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Essentially, the Monado is an energy-like weapon that has the ability to manipulate ether and is basically whatever the wielder, Shulk, wills it to be, as it's a shape-shifting weapon of some sort that also grants the wielder the ability to see the future. It's a lot more complex than that, but to keep things from carrying on for so long, we'll just leave it at that. Number 5, Masamune, Final Fantasy VII. Surprise, we're back with yet another Final Fantasy weapon, and this time we are looking at the infamous sword of the one-winged angel himself, Sephiroth. Masamune, no, not that one, is a long samurai sword wielded by the main villain of the Final Fantasy VII games. I say games because you got Rebirth, Remake, and the original game. I know, it's a bit confusing if you're not a Final Fantasy fan. Anyways, Sephiroth's sword is most iconic for its incredible size that makes all other swords on this list look small in comparison. Like, really small. Seriously, this thing literally looks like it could take out an entire moon in one strike. Which is also pretty fitting considering how formidable Sephiroth is in just about every version of Final Fantasy VII out there. Because of its long reach, the iconic villain that wields it in Final Fantasy VII, and the fact that a variation of this sword also appears in just about every Square Enix RPG out there, Sephiroth's Masamune is without a doubt one of the most iconic swords in video game history. Yet, despite saying that, it's not exactly the most iconic sword in the same game that it's from. Which brings me to the next entry on today's list. Number 4, Buster Sword, Final Fantasy VII. Yes, back-to-back Final Fantasy VII swords, only this time we look at the most iconic sword in Final Fantasy history, Cloud's Buster Sword. While Sephiroth's Masamune is one to remember thanks to the villain that wields it, and Squall's Revolver Gunblade is the most impractical yet badass looking weapon of the series, neither of those famous blades hold up against the Buster Sword in terms of how iconic these swords are. Yeah, if you were to take 3 pictures of each of these swords and show each of them to casual Final Fantasy fans, I can almost guarantee you that if they were to name any of them, it would probably be the Buster Sword. As it's the main weapon wielded by arguably one of the most popular main protagonists of the Final Fantasy series, it's no wonder why this sword is so famous with fans of RPGs. Plus, it just looks way too cool to not immediately fall in love with it. The size of the sword and the fact that Cloud could easily swing it around with one hand at times is just absolutely incredible. Also, it can have materia attached to it, which allows the sword to perform additional spells to help enhance Cloud's combat skills. Overall, the Buster Sword is one of the coolest and most badass looking swords on this list. And in a franchise that's famous for having iconic weapons, it somehow stands out more than any other sword in Final Fantasy. Number 3, the Master Sword, Zelda franchise. While I barely considered most Zelda games as RPGs, I think it's at least fair to say that some of them, like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, are action RPGs. So I decided to include the most famous time-traveling sword itself, the Master Sword, on today's list of most iconic blades in role-playing games. To dive into the lore of the Master Sword from the Zelda series would honestly take all day, as the history and abilities of said sword is different depending on which timeline and video game we are looking at. However, the basics are pretty much the same. The Master Sword is the most powerful weapon in each of the Zelda games, in which the main protagonist of the series, Link, must retrieve it and use it against the forces of darkness that surround the Kingdom of Hyrule. Funny enough, it has a lot of similarities to the legendary sword of King Arthur himself, Excalibur, including the fact that in a lot of cases, Link will need to revisit the sword when he is worthy enough before he can pull it out of the stone that it's impaled in. Anyway, considering that the design of the sword has stayed mostly consistent throughout the 29-ish games of the franchise, obviously the Master Sword has become one of the most recognizable weapons in video game history. Also, we are talking about one of the most famous Nintendo franchises of all time, right behind Mario, so it stands to reason that the sword that has appeared in just about every Zelda game out there would earn itself a spot in the top 3, at the very least, for most iconic blades in role-playing games. Number 2, Keyblade, Kingdom Hearts. If you wanted to be more specific, the Kingdom Key Keyblade is the one that will be claiming the number 2 spot on today's list. Anyway, the hardcore Kingdom Hearts fan inside of me wanted to push this one up to the number 1 spot. Hell, I'm sure bias played a major part as to why I made it this high up on today's list to begin with. However, I decided to settle for the number 2 spot, and you'll understand why later. Regardless, the Keyblade is one of the most unique looking weapons in video games, period. Instead of wielding a regular sword, the main protagonist of the game, Sora, wields a blade that is shaped like, well, a key, obviously. The Keyblade has all sorts of uses and abilities. It can perform spells, defeat the darkness, and even unlock keyholes within the worlds themselves to open new routes to other worlds. There's not many games out there that you can think of that have a weapon so unique that when you see it, you immediately know what franchise it's referring to. That's definitely the case with the Keyblade, especially the Kingdom Key. While the design may seem relatively basic as it looks like a giant key, it has other attributes about it that immediately connect people to Kingdom Hearts. For example, the Mickey Mouse keychain tells people immediately that's connected to a Disney game, and it doesn't take long for people to connect that idea to Kingdom Hearts. By the way, when I mentioned being guilty of buying real-life replicas of video game swords, this is what I was referring to. Anyway, Kingdom Hearts is one of my favorite video game franchises of all time, and the Keyblade is without a doubt one of the most iconic weapons seen in an RPG. Anyways, before we take a look at the number 1 entry, let's first take a look at a few other blades that just barely missed out on making the top 10 most iconic blades in RPGs.
Damn it. Damn! It's fast!
Number 1, lightsabers, Star Wars. I know, the number 1 entry on today's list is kind of cheating, but hey, I did say blades. And a lightsaber is definitely a blade, well, I guess a laser blade or a laser sword. Plus, there are plenty of Star Wars RPGs like Knights of the Old Republic and the 2 Star Wars Jedi games, so when you considered all of that, you kind of have to include lightsabers into the mix when you're looking at the most iconic blades in RPGs. Granted, lightsabers are more so the most iconic blades because of the movies, not the games, but I digress. Anyway, when it comes to games like Fallen Order and Knights of the Old Republic, being a Jedi and wielding your very own customizable lightsaber just feels absolutely incredible. I mean, in Jedi Survivor, for example, you get the ability to change the colors, customize the different stances, and even your Force abilities to fully experience the Jedi experience in a way that you prefer to do so. With a blade that has the ability to deflect most attacks and even reflect lasers at the enemy, you can't help but feel like a true badass in those games. And it obviously doesn't take a fan of Star Wars to know what a lightsaber is when they see it. So for that reason, obviously lightsabers are without a doubt the most iconic blades in RPGs. But that does it for this episode of Fantasy Kingdom. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is the lightsaber the most iconic blade in an RPG, or is there a different blade deserving of that title? Also, let me know any other blades that didn't make my list that you think deserves a special shout out in the comments down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more RPG content. Also, leave a like in today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Fantasy Kingdom. Take care.